السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونعوذ بالله تعالى من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله. قال الله عز وجل في القرآن الكريم: أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم، بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. يا أيها الذين آمنوا اتقوا الله حق تقاته ولا تموتن إلا وأنتم مسلمون. يا أيها الناس اتقوا ربكم الذي خلقكم من نفس واحدة وخلق منها زوجها وبث منهما رجالا كثيرا ونساء واتقوا الله الذي تساءلون به والأرحام إن الله كان عليكم رقيبا. يا أيها الذين آمنوا اتقوا الله وقولوا قولا سديدا يصلح لكم أعمالكم ويغفر لكم ذنوبكم ومن يطع الله ورسوله فقد فاز فوزا عظيما. أما بعد، فإن أصدق الحديث كتاب الله وخير الهدي هدي محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم وشر الأمور محدثاتها وكل محدثة بدعة وكل بدعة ضلالة وكل ضلالة في النار ثم أما بعد. So the story that I chose to share with everyone today in today's khutbah is the story of Salman Al-Farsi. And the reason I picked this story isn't so much that it's an unknown or an obscure story or something that's lost or forgotten, but I think this is one of those khutbah topics that should be regularly discussed, or at least the lessons from it we should be regularly reminded of. And so, who exactly was Salman Al-Farsi, right? So, as his name obviously suggests, in English he would be translated to Salman the Persian. And Salman Al-Farsi, he resided in what's one of the oldest cities in Iran, and which is called Isfahan. And the area that he was in at the time that he was living, it was home to a lot of these groups of people called the Zoroastrians. And the Zoroastrians, they traced their roots back to this emperor named Zoroaster. And the religion is almost entirely based around these two separate entities, and those entities and like this balance of good and evil are represented by this eternal flame. And so in essence, they're essentially fire worshippers. And so Salman Al-Farsi, he came from a family of Zoroastrians, so he came from a family of fire worshippers. And his father was kind of almost like a priest or one of the head figures in their temple, you could say, in the Zoroastrian temple. And he was also one of the head figures within the area. And so Salman Al-Farsi, when he was raised within his father's house, his father taught him how to keep up the fire, all the religious duties, all the importances of priesthood. And so Salman Al-Farsi grew up with this background. And he was so beloved to his father. His father loved him so much that he was very possessive of him. And in that possession, he refused to ever let him leave the house. So he would keep him confined inside, and Salman Al-Farsi was never to leave the home. His only purpose was to upkeep the fire, or the flame, for the purposes of worship, and that was about it. And eventually Salman Al-Farsi, as his father got wealthier and his businesses started to expand, and as Salman Al-Farsi got older, he sort of handed off a few duties to him, things to take care of. And one of the first of these, and actually where this whole story starts, is that Salman Al-Farsi's father had this garden. And the garden was, it's not really known if it was, like just a garden for aesthetic purposes or if it was a garden that served an actual purpose. But Salman Al-Farsi, he begins this story here when he narrates this in the story and hadith to Abdullah ibn Abbas. And he says that my father, he went out one day with other work that he had to do, and he told me, you go tend to the garden today, that this is going to be your job. And so Salman Al-Farsi excitedly sets out. He can finally leave the home, and he leaves, and he begins walking towards this garden. And as he's walking, he starts to hear these noises coming out of this building next to him. And so he takes a quick detour to see what's going on in this building. He hears these beautiful songs, and he walks in. And when he goes in, it's a church. And in the church, there's all these worshipers, and they're singing hymns, and, he's moved by the way that they're worshiping God. And he demands to know, he asks them frantically, he says, where is this religion from? This is such a beautiful religion, where does it originate? And they mentioned to him, they said that this is from Syria, the religion that we're practicing, it originates from Syria. And so Salman Al-Farsi spends the whole day there, sort of just in a trance, obsessed with these hymns, and he asks them, he says, that when the travelers, when all of you depart to go back to Syria, let me know so that I can come with you to see this religion. And so Salman Al-Farsi, he comes back home and excitedly, he's ready to tell his father about this experience. And his father is like, why didn't you tend to the garden, right? I walked past the garden, it's untended, what happened? And so Salman Al-Farsi begins to describe this beautiful scene in the church, and his father gets very upset and he says, those people, their religion is not better than ours. And Salman Al-Farsi disagrees. He says, no, whatever they're practicing is much better than us. And in his anger, Salman Al-Farsi's father, he shackles him with chains that he chains to his wrists, chains to his feet, and then he connects those chains together. So Salman Al-Farsi is essentially as shackled as he's ever been, more so than he was before. But he was still determined. He was obsessed and he was moved by this religion, and so he sent a messenger to figure out when that caravan was going to be leaving. And when the caravan eventually left, and he got news of this, he broke the shackles and he escaped and he left with them to go to Syria. And when he gets to Syria, he finds this bishop that he's amazed by, and he says he's so pious and he's doing all this worship, and he encouraged everyone to constantly give in charity, to constantly help the poor. And so Salman Al-Farsi said, take me under your wing, essentially, and sort of show me what it means to practice this religion. And so Salman Al-Farsi becomes the mentee of this bishop, of this priest. And eventually Salman Al-Farsi sees something that's very disturbing. Towards the end of this bishop's life, he sees that he has 7 chests of gold kept for himself. That he was essentially pocketing and funneling the money that was coming out of this church. And so Salman Al-Farsi becomes very hurt and very angered, and at the time that this bishop dies, he announces to everyone in the area. He says, this person, this bishop, he was corrupt. And he proves to everyone, he opens these chests and he shows them, look. And so eventually people in their anger, they come and they appoint another bishop to replace this corrupt man. And Salman Al-Farsi does the same thing with this bishop. He asks to be taken under his wing, he asks to be mentored. And eventually this bishop is nearing the end of his life. And Salman Al-Farsi sort of begins to panic here, and he says that, I've spent my whole life learning from you. I haven't seen anyone, and Salman Al-Farsi narrates this, anyone who does not pray the 5 prayers, so anyone who is a non-Muslim, I had not seen a single man better than him. That's how much he praises him. And Salman Al-Farsi, he sort of demands to know, where can I go to find the next person who follows your religion? And this new bishop, he gives him like a doomsday sort of sentence. He says, the population is doomed. There's no one upon the religion that I'm on. But if you want to go find someone who's close, like a close second, go to Mosul. And so Salman Al-Farsi says, okay. And he sets out from Mosul. And he goes to Mosul, and the same thing happens. He gets adopted by this, or not adopted, but he takes up this another bishop as his mentor in Mosul, and the same story happens. As the bishop's dying, he asks, where do I go next? And now the bishop says, the next person who is the closest in character to me, he lives in Nusaybin. Go there. And so Salman Al-Farsi sets out for that destination. And when he gets there, he says to the same bishop again, to the next bishop, that now that you're dying, where do I go next? And now he points him to Amuria. And so Salman Al-Farsi sets out for Amuria. And in Amuria, he is finally in his final breath, the bishop there as well. And by this time, Salman Al-Farsi explains that I had gone from so many different places and had essentially built a network of merchandise where I had amassed this wealth of cows and sheep and cattle and whatnot, where he was a very wealthy shepherd, or at least wealthy by those standards. And so he says, when I get to Amuria and this person is passing away, this is when the story gets very interesting. He says, there's no one close to me, and the people, he says the same thing, the population is doomed. But this time, he says, there's someone who is going to come. And so this time he's giving a prophecy. He says, there's someone who is going to come. And he says he's a prophet, and he will say that his lineage and his descent traces all the way back to Ibrahim alayhi salam. And he says that it'll be very obvious when you see him. And he sort of lists these characteristics. The first thing he says this prophet, he's going to seek refuge and immigrate to a city that's between two black rocks, and in between everything is palm trees and an oasis. And so these is one of the first characteristics that he lists. The second characteristic that he lists, or the second trait that he lists, he explains that if you were to give him something in charity, if you were to take a gift, or if you were to take an item and say this is charity for you, he would reject it. He wouldn't accept from it. But if you were to say that exact same thing is a gift, he'd accept it happily and take from it. And the last condition he says, and he points this man right here in the small of his back, between his shoulder blades, he says between the shoulder blades, there's going to be a mark as clear as day. When you see it, it's the seal of prophethood, and you know that this is the person that I'm talking about. And so Salman Al-Farsi, he shows the most excitement that he's ever shown in his life, and he says, I need to go to whatever this place is. I need to go to the Arabian Peninsula. I need to find this man. And Salman Al-Farsi, he says, I'm going to set out with this group of merchants who are traveling as a caravan, and he says, I will give you for free all of my cattle, my sheep, everything, if you just take me with you to this place. And eventually what happened was that Salman Al-Farsi follows this caravan, and instead of taking him to where the Prophet ﷺ was, they took him to a place called Wadi al-Qura. And there, they sold him to a Jewish slave master. And Salman Al-Farsi becomes very, very depressed, because obviously this was not the road that he wanted to follow, this was not the plan that he had intended. And he's waiting, and he's waiting, and he's waiting, and he sort of sees when he gets there that there's some trees, there's some type of an oasis, maybe this is the area that the Prophet ﷺ is supposed to come to. The Prophet ﷺ doesn't come there. And this Jewish slave master, he eventually sells Salman Al-Farsi to his cousin in Medina. And when Salman Al-Farsi arrives in Medina, he's working as a slave, and his job was to pick these fruit. It's disputed whether it's dates or something else, but to pick these fruit from trees. And so he's picking them, and he's picking them, and he's picking them. And he overhears his slave master's, I believe cousin, if I remember correctly, memory serves me correctly, his slave master's cousin, saying that he's cursing the people of Medina. That they're welcoming the Prophet ﷺ, they're welcoming this man who is causing this religious revolution within the peninsula. And Salman Al-Farsi, he becomes so shaken that he goes up and he holds this man, and he grabs him by his cloth, and he shakes him like this, and he says, what are you saying? What do you say? He demands to know what he's saying. So Salman Al-Farsi's slave master, he strikes him against the head, and he says, this isn't your business as a slave. And now Salman Al-Farsi, he gets this fervor and he gets this excitement that, the Prophet ﷺ is coming to Medina. And when Salman Al-Farsi hears this word, that he's coming to Medina, he hatches sort of this plan. He says, okay, I'm going to find a way to figure out if this man is truly the Prophet. And so he takes these fruit that he was picking and he puts them in his, I don't know what the English word is for this, but he puts them in like the cloth and he wraps it like this and he takes it to the Prophet ﷺ. And his companions are all there, and Salman Al-Farsi says to the Prophet ﷺ, he says, I see that you have a lot of companions. They look, not to be in the best of conditions. And I know that you have just arrived here, so I've brought these fruit for you as charity. And the Prophet ﷺ, he took it, set it on the ground, and he pointed to it, and he told his companions to eat from it. But Salman Al-Farsi, he noticed the Prophet ﷺ himself did not actually eat from this batch of fruit. So Salman Al-Farsi checks off sign number 2. He's come to this area of oasis between two mountains, and he's rejected charity. So those 2 signs are checked off. Next sign, Salman Al-Farsi does the same thing, brings this batch of fruit, and he goes to the Prophet ﷺ. This time he says, this is here for you as a gift. And the Prophet ﷺ not only shares it with his companions, but this time he eats from it as well. And so sign number 3 is finally checked off. And the last sign is almost comical. Salman Al-Farsi, he went and he heard that there was a proceeding where one of the companions of the Prophet ﷺ had passed away. I don't recall which one exactly, but one of the companions had passed away. And the Prophet ﷺ, he was wearing these 2 sheets, sort of these 2 cloths that were black, and they were like hanging over his back. They were very loose. And so Salman Al-Farsi, he tries to be subtle about it, and he essentially walks around in a circle behind the Prophet ﷺ, trying to see if he can get a glimpse of this mark. And the Prophet ﷺ, he understands what's going on. He understands that this man's probably been given some type of an information as to the signs of the prophethood, and he lets his cloak fall slightly. And when it falls, the seal of the prophethood is visible to Salman Al-Farsi, and he begins to cry profusely. And he hugs the Prophet ﷺ, he embraces him and he puts his arms around his neck, and he starts crying profusely, and he says, I've searched for you everywhere. And he explains his whole journey of the Prophet ﷺ, all the way beginning from that story of the garden. And he now explains that, this is my condition and I'm a slave. As the Prophet ﷺ, he tells Salman Al-Farsi, draw up this contract so that we can free you. Figure out some type of negotiation with your slave master. And the slave master and Salman Al-Farsi, they come up with this agreement that Salman Al-Farsi will only be freed if the slave master receives 300 trees and 40 of these weight units of gold. And so the Prophet ﷺ, he says to the Sahaba that no matter what, we are going to free Salman Al-Farsi, so figure out a way for us to raise this. And so every companion brought whatever they could. Some brought 30 trees, some brought 5, some brought a sapling. Everyone did the absolute best they could. And the Prophet ﷺ, he told Salman Al-Farsi, dig all of these holes, dig the 300 holes, and I will plant all of these trees by my own hand. I will do that for you. And once all of the trees are planted, Salman Al-Farsi actually pauses in this conversation. Remember, there's a conversation between him and Abdullah ibn Abbas. And he pauses here and he says to Abdullah ibn Abbas, he says that by Allah, there is not a single one of those trees that the Prophet ﷺ planted that died. Every single one of them lived. And he continues the story. And he says that once these 300 trees were planted, the issue became of gold. How do we raise this gold? And one of the companions, he brought an egg-sized shape of gold this big to the Prophet ﷺ, and Salman Al-Farsi panics. He's like, what am I going to do with this? I'm not going to be free, right? There's such a small unit, such a small piece of gold. And subhanAllah, the Prophet ﷺ told him that he assured him that no, this gold will be enough, and when they weighed it, it ended up being exactly 40, and Salman Al-Farsi was freed. And the tragic part for Salman Al-Farsi was during this initial time period, before he was freed, he ended up missing the battles of Uhud and the battle of Badr. And this time when he was recruited for the battle of Khandaq, the battle of Khandaq is literally named because of something that Salman Al-Farsi came up with. And at the time of the Persians, the Safavids, this is very ancient Persian warfare strategy, for anyone who's interested in history. But the Persians, they were very good at trench warfare. And the reason being for it, that despite other enemies, if they had the high ground, what the Persians would do was in digging these trenches, they were able to dig them so quickly and get underneath the ground, obviously, and that the enemy would essentially not be able to see them. There was no target for the enemy to fire against them, right? Because they're hidden, you can't see them. And so Salman Al-Farsi, he suggests this strategy. He says that in my sort of home area, this is the strategy that we use. And the Prophet and Sahaba, they eventually ended up, of course, digging the trenches in the Battle of Khandaq and winning the battle. And Salman Al-Farsi, from this point on, becomes a not just a very relevant, one of the most essential companions. And the reason I bring up this khutbah, the reason I bring up this story, is because there's not just 1-2 lessons that we can take from it, but Salman Al-Farsi's story is so long, obviously, that there's multiple. And those lessons aren't just lessons that are metaphorical or allegorical or abstract or whatever you may think, but they're ones that we can apply in our daily lives. And inshallah we'll get into that in the second half of the khutbah. قولوا قولي هذا واستغفر الله لي ولكم. Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wa salatu wassalamu ala rasulullah. So, and I know I'm running out of time, but the reason I bring up this khutbah, I want to focus on 2 specific lessons from this sermon. The first is actually about the bishop, the first bishop that Salman Al-Farsi came across, the bishop that was in Syria. And this bishop in Syria, if you notice, Salman Al-Farsi, his entire appreciation for this bishop and his entire tarnishing of his reputation came from 2 things. And it was the outward expression of what that bishop did, what he practiced outwardly. And the reason I bring this up is, ironically, this is a lesson from the bishop, actually, of what not to do. Because the bishop, he was essentially giving da'wah to Salman Al-Farsi, right? In, I guess, whatever Christian form that may take place. And it was essentially nullified by the fact that he was corrupt, by the fact that he opened up these treasure chests. It did absolutely nothing for Salman Al-Farsi that he encouraged people to give in charity. That Salman Al-Farsi thought that he was someone who, had all of these important principles that were outlined in Christianity. It didn't matter that he seemed like a good person, that he spoke nicely, that he was knowledgeable. All of this was washed down the drain with one act, right? The reason I bring this up is that we need to be cognizant of the exact same practices within our own da'wah, within our own spreading of the religion. And the reason that this is so key is because, especially in a place like this, in a place like the US, our da'wah is not really evaluated on principles. No one really argues with Islam on the warranting level. No one argues with Islam on its principle. People tend to argue with Islam on what the perception of Muslims are, right? Almost all the arguments you hear about Islam in the mainstream media are about what either terrorist groups are doing in the name of Islam, or what some other random Muslim person of influence did, and how that's being extrapolated to all of the deen. And that makes this essentially important for us, and even more important, that our character should be not the only, but the primary form of da'wah. That the way that we carry ourselves, the way that we show ourselves to others, is the primary form of da'wah. And the second reason that I bring this up, and probably the most important that I bring this khutbah up, is Salman Al-Farsi's journey itself. Salman Al-Farsi started in probably the farthest type of religious practice from Islam. Zoroastrianism has virtually nothing in common. You can at least extrapolate from other religions 1 or 2 or 3 points. At its core, at its fundamentalist core, Zoroastrianism is completely different. And Salman Al-Farsi, despite the fact that each one of his mentors passed away, he had this unquenchable thirst, not just for knowledge, but for a certain type of peace. And he was looking for this tranquility that he could get from religion. And he was looking that something would be able to soothe his soul. And he uprooted his entire life in the process. He left his father, who had given him everything. He had given him a beautiful home, beautiful garden to upkeep. He had given him status. He went to Syria, which at the time was flourishing in trade. And he left that as well. And he kept going from town to town to town to town, and nothing mattered, so much so when he had even reached the peak of his wealth. The peak point of his wealth. When he had all of these animals, he did what? He gave them all away. Just for the possibility that he might be able to reach a certain soothing of his heart, a certain type of education, certain type of Islamic or a certain type of religious peace. And the same thing goes for when he was at the absolute bottom of his life, when he was a slave. That didn't stop him either. And the reason I bring this up is because Salman Al-Farsi's life and his journey is a metaphor for the fact that our religion is not one that's passive. The way that our religion works and the way that religion in general works is that there's not a one-time stamp that you do that sort of sets you in for good. That, at this point, once I just accomplish this one thing or once I do this one thing, that's it. It's like a foot off the gas type of a deal. That's not the case in our religion. And I'm sure we've all noticed it within our lives as well. There's ups and downs that you have in your iman. You notice that when you start to get absorbed in things like work, when you start to get absorbed in things like school, when you start to leave out, I'm not going to revise Quran today, I'm not going to do this, that, or the other. Slowly, one by one, things start getting picked off. So much so where you start questioning yourself, how many times do I even remember Allah in a day? How many times do I even think about Allah in a day? Does my salah even have khushu? Right? And we contrast that to the life of Salman Al-Farsi. And we should have the exact same goal. That when we reach those periods of low iman, when we reach those periods of low faith, when we reach those periods of questioning, that we should strive to have that same unquenchable thirst. And if you have that feeling, that's a blessing from Allah that you should never ignore. It should never be something that makes you uncomfortable in a bad way, but rather it should be something that pushes you towards good. And that you have this feeling, and I need to quench it with improving my iman. I need to quench it with surrounding myself with good people. I need to quench it with giving charity. I need to quench it with improving my akhlaq, whatever the case may be. Right? And the important thing to understand is that for Salman Al-Farsi, the stakes were much higher than they are for us. For us, it's oftentimes picking up a book or reading Quran, like we can just open on our apps, or reading a book of hadith that's already been collected and compiled for us. That was not the case for Salman Al-Farsi. He had nothing, he had no blueprint to even begin with. Islam had even just started when he reached there. Even then, his iman was questioned by the fact that was quite frankly one of the worst times to be a Muslim. And still that didn't stop him. So the question I want to leave us with this is that if Salman Al-Farsi, in one of the most challenging times of his life, both in when he had status and when he didn't, if he was able to pursue that unquenchable thirst, why can't we? May Allah Azza wa Jalla allow us all to follow the example of Salman Al-Farsi. ربنا ولا تحملنا ما لا طاقة لنا به واعف عنا واغفر لنا وارحمنا أنت مولانا فانصرنا على القوم الكافرين. اللهم صل على محمد وعلى آل محمد كما صليت على إبراهيم وعلى آل إبراهيم إنك حميد مجيد. اللهم بارك على محمد وعلى آل محمد كما باركت على إبراهيم وعلى آل إبراهيم إنك حميد مجيد. ربنا آتنا في الدنيا حسنة وفي الآخرة حسنة وقنا عذاب النار. اللهم اغفر للمسلمين والمسلمات والمؤمنين والمؤمنات الأحياء منهم والأموات إنك سميع مجيب الدعوات. إن الله يأمر بالعدل والإحسان وإيتاء ذي القربى وينهى عن الفحشاء والمنكر والبغي يعظكم لعلكم تذكرون وأقيموا الصلاة.